What's next for Lewis Hamilton? Well, Lewis Hamilton joined Ferrari for the 2025 season with the intention of winning his 8th championship. What better story for him to come back 4 years in the waiting after he was robbed of what was rightfully his, to win the 8th title, cement himself as the undisputed greatest in history. But so far, Hamilton is unfortunately not living up to these expectations, and this objective, this aim, this goal looks further than it ever did. Winning the 8th title after 2021 was always going to be a tough ask of Hamilton. Red Bull's pace, Mercedes' uncompetitiveness in the ground effect era in the first few years sort of laid the foundations that Hamilton, if he wanted to win the 8th title, he had to either wait for the next regulation cycle or had to simply, by this time, wait for his competitors to fall off, because the team he was at, Mercedes, simply did not have the pace that they did before. Mercedes, even though they showed brilliance at times in the ground effect era, but as I said, at times, occasionally, not consistently like Red Bull, and now we're seeing McLaren with the dominance that they've acquired. And when Mercedes were occasionally fast, this is when Hamilton showed his brilliance. Even though it took him a long time to get his first win in the ground effect era, it took him until 2024, there's no denying that he was on par with his teammate George Russell, and arguably had the edge on him head to head in the entire duration that they were teammates. And if we look at 2024, which was one of Hamilton's weakest seasons, he showed moments of brilliance to win those 2 races in the mid-season when Mercedes were most competitive. And that competitiveness he had when it mattered, being clinical when it mattered, is arguably what led him to finish ahead of George Russell in the standings. So even though the ground effect era was mostly a disappointment, that it was almost like 3 years went to waste for him not being able to avenge his world title misfortune, he ended it in a high note, on a positive, and joining Ferrari with this momentum, with Ferrari having the momentum in 2024, going from on the back foot because of Red Bull's dominance in 2023 to being quite competitive in 2024, even though McLaren was the main contender to Red Bull. Ferrari showed a lot of promise in a lot of races that season, particularly in the mid to late season. But 2025, that all goes in the bin. We have Ferrari saying that they've changed 95% of the car going into 2025, so making some radical changes, which I found to be a surprise, because if they stayed on that trajectory by not making radical changes but building the strong competitive car that they already had, which clearly was finding pace in 2024 to become competitive, they decided to change a lot of things, and it seems to not have worked. 2025, McLaren are extremely dominant, the same way Red Bull were in 2023. And Ferrari, unfortunately, are not only on the back foot to McLaren, but are consistently on the back foot to teams like Mercedes, Red Bull, and now even Racing Bulls in recent races with their emergence. And this is really compounding Hamilton's mental struggles. It's because he's now going further and further away from this 8th title. And next year, 2026, is looking to be his last chance to achieve this. We know that 2025, for any non-McLaren driver, has gone out the window. It was obvious from the start of the season that Ferrari wasn't going to be competitive, even though Hamilton had that amazing win in China in the sprint. McLaren's pace advantage, and then seeing Red Bull fall off and McLaren get even faster, and Ferrari and also Mercedes doing nothing about it, is extremely disappointing, obviously, for Hamilton and his peers. But specifically for Hamilton, I think that next year is going to truly be his last chance. I think that next year, if Ferrari are not competitive, then Hamilton will probably retire at the end of that season. If Ferrari are competitive, then I think that is his last chance. The reason being that Leclerc is in his prime, and if he's not in his prime, he's going to be slowly entering it, because the more seasons go on, the more complete I see Leclerc becoming. He's always at that natural pace to challenge the greats of F1 like Verstappen, as he has beaten Verstappen on many occasions previously. And we're seeing now Leclerc against Hamilton, consistently beating Hamilton, even though this is Hamilton far from his best. So I think next year it will be Hamilton's last chance, because I think that to win the title, he will need to beat Leclerc. And I think that if Ferrari are not competitive, the way Ferrari are operationally now, I don't see that changing in 1 year. Ferrari need a car similar to 2022, where they were competitive at the start, but they need some luck on their hands. They need there not to be a technical directive like there was in 2022 that hindered their progress. So if Ferrari are competitive throughout 2026, I think that is Hamilton's chance. Then, and if he doesn't win that year, then I think the opportunities are gone. Because more likely than not, Verstappen will emerge again as a title contender, because the way things are going, I don't see Red Bull being competitive in 2026. And it will probably be, McLaren will probably be competitive again, but we simply do not know. But that's what it's shaping out to be. And I think that if Ferrari aren't at least the second fastest car, if they aren't competitive enough to consistently win races and at least fight for the championship for most of the season, then I think that's Hamilton's last chance. Because 2027, we don't know what will happen. As I said, Verstappen may emerge, somebody else might emerge, another team might. And I think that the more time goes on where Hamilton, the more time goes on since 2021, and the more chances that Hamilton and Ferrari are, you could say, wasting or are slipping away from them, if it's not wasting, then that's going to compound his mental problems. It's going to compound, his lack of pace, you could say, pretty much compound him in a negative way. The negativity is compounded in a multifaceted way. And I think that what's next for him is just one last opportunity next year. If he wins the 8th title, he can just retire and become the undisputed greatest, and a legacy that is immortal, which he already has to an extent, but this time it will be immortalized, because being the first Ferrari driver in almost 2 decades to win a title, and then to do it in that fashion after getting robbed and waiting for more than half a decade to avenge himself. So I think what's next is he needs to keep his head in the game. He needs to treat this year like last year with Mercedes, except he needs to realize that he's not dealing with the operationally efficient Mercedes, he's dealing with Ferrari. The name of Ferrari is enough to think that it's an amazing team, but Ferrari operationally, the last 20 years, has subverted the orthodoxy of Ferrari that we're used to in Ferrari's history, because the last 20 years for Ferrari have been an embarrassment of constant underperformance. But I think that with Hamilton and Leclerc in the same team going into new regulations, I think 2026 is their chance to really do something. We have to only wait and see, because obviously there's a lot of speculation. 2026, we really don't know who's going to be competitive. But I think it's looking like that's going to be his last chance, because I feel like everyone else is simply going to get better. And Hamilton, unfortunately, time is against him. He is going further and further away from his prime. And next year, that new regulation change, if it will just click for him, one amazing year, one last dance, win the title, retire, become immortalized. So I think that's what's next for Hamilton. He's got one last chance next year. If he performs, I think beating Leclerc, if Ferrari is competitive, all he needs to do is about beating Leclerc, which is going to be a tough ask because Leclerc is in his prime. But winning the 8th title was always going to be a tough ask. So Hamilton needs to put his head back in the game, because the raw pace is certainly there. It's a mental thing and it's an application thing. He needs to figure out a way to zone in like he did in previous years, to lock in, be clinical when it matters, and to apply himself like he did in his dominant years, in the years where the cars were close, and his pace advantage, his consistency, his racecraft made the difference. So I think that's what Hamilton needs to do. And what's next for him? Next year is going to define what's next for him. Either being immortalized as the 8-time world champion, or as having one of the greatest legacies of all time, but still that question mark about him being the actual GOAT. Because if he doesn't win the 8th, then the debate is still wide open. But if he wins the 8th, then for most people, including myself, he'll be the undisputed GOAT. Thank you for watching, guys. Please like the video and subscribe if you haven't for similar videos. Take care.